Thanksgiving is supposed to be a holiday of gratitude, a day where the smell of turkey fills the air, where laughter rises from the dining room, and where family feels like family again, no matter what's happened during the rest of the year. That's what I thought I was walking into. The day began normally enough. The kitchen was alive with noise, Margaret pulling trays from the oven, checking on the turkey, fussing over seasoning. She had always taken pride in her holiday spread. My wife was a perfectionist in the kitchen, and to anyone watching, she looked like the picture of a devoted hostess. Brianna and her husband, Dan, arrived around noon. My daughter breezed through the front door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, balancing a pie in one hand and a tote bag of gifts in the other. She looked polished, as always, sharp blazer over a fall sweater, hair swept neatly back. Beside her, Dan was the picture of confidence. That man had a lawyer's charm that could fill a room. But to me, it always felt like a mask. The four of us settled in quickly. Margaret poured wine, Brianna set the pie in the kitchen, Dan cracked a joke about traffic on the interstate. It all felt so ordinary. But if you live with someone long enough, you learn to spot the cracks in the performance. Margaret was moving a little too quickly, laughing a little too loudly, pressing her hand on Dan's shoulder in ways that made me look twice. The table was set beautifully, crystal glasses polished, silverware gleaming, the casserole dish steaming at the center. Margaret's casserole was famous in our family. She guarded the recipe like a state secret. She beamed with pride as she placed it down, as though she had once again delivered proof of her devotion. We sat, we ate, and we talked. Laughter flowed easily enough. Stories about Brianna's college years, updates on her psychology practice, a few sarcastic jokes from Dan about his courtroom battles. I smiled, nodded, played the part of the content husband and father. But under the warmth, something in the air felt off. Margaret touched her wine glass more than usual. Dan's eyes lingered on her longer than a son-in-law's should. And Brianna, sharp as ever, kept glancing at the two of them with a faint crease in her brow. After dinner, I excused myself. Going upstairs to grab a jacket, I said. The night air had turned cold, and I planned to fetch the one I kept in the upstairs closet. As I walked down the hall toward the bedroom, I caught voices coming from Brianna's old room. At first, I thought she and Dan were having a private conversation. But as I neared the door, I recognized Margaret's voice. I froze. The words were quiet, but clear enough to cut me open. When the old fool finally signs the papers, Margaret whispered, "We'll have everything we planned for." My breath caught. Dan chuckled softly, the way he did in court when he thought he had an opponent cornered. "It won't be long. We'll move assets and stages, adjust filings. He won't see it coming. By the time he realizes, everything will be tied up legally." Margaret laughed, light, mocking, almost girlish. Can you imagine? 25 years of playing the devoted wife, and he still believes it. I gripped the doorframe to keep myself steady. They went on, cold, calculated, speaking in legal terms like it was business. Fees, timelines, strategies. Margaret's voice held no hesitation, no guilt, only contempt. I wanted to burst in, demand an explanation, shout until the walls rattled. But something stopped me. Maybe it was shock, maybe it was survival. Instead, I stood there, silent, the blood roaring in my ears, memorizing every word. The jacket hung in the closet just a few feet away, but I never reached for it. I turned, walked back downstairs, and forced my face into a mask of calm. When I returned, Brianna asked lightly, "Find your jacket?" I nodded. "Yes." Margaret poured herself another glass of wine, smiling at me as though nothing had happened, as though my world hadn't just collapsed upstairs. I sat back at the table, lifted my fork, and tasted the casserole. It might have been the best one she'd ever made. And yet, every bite turned to ash in my mouth. That night, As the house quieted and everyone drifted off to sleep, I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling. My wife of 25 years, the woman I had built a life with, was conspiring with my son-in-law to strip me of everything I'd earned. Betrayal doesn't always crash in like a storm. Sometimes it seeps in, slow and cold, settling into your bones until you can't ignore it. I didn't know what the coming days would bring, but I knew one thing with certainty. Nothing in my house, nothing in my marriage, was real anymore. The holiday meant to unite my family had revealed the truth. Thanksgiving was the day everything broke. For 6 days after Thanksgiving, I lived with knowledge that gnawed at me like acid. 6 days of waking up beside Margaret, pretending nothing had changed. 6 days of eating meals across from her at the table, nodding along to idle conversation, while her voice from that recording looped endlessly in my mind. When the old fool finally signs the papers, those words became a curse. I went to work each morning at Cole Construction, the business I had poured 35 years into, and tried to keep my focus on blueprints, invoices, and schedules. But behind every calculation, I saw Margaret smile as she poured wine for Dan. Behind every handshake, I heard their whispered laughter about timelines and asset division. I wasn't just betrayed as a husband. I was betrayed as a man who believed in honesty, in family, in the sanctity of marriage vows. I had trusted her completely, and she had used that trust as currency in a conspiracy. It would have been easier if Margaret's betrayal had been hers alone. But Dan, my son-in-law, the man who had married my daughter, who had sat at my table countless times and toasted to family, was her partner in this scheme. And worst of all, Brianna, my sweet girl. She had no idea, or so I thought. That week stretched into a blur of half-truths. Margaret moved through the house with a confidence that made my stomach churn. She kissed me on the cheek before heading to her charity meetings, hummed as she folded laundry, carried on as though we were living the same life we always had. But it was all theater. I started noticing details I'd been blind to before. Phone calls that ended the moment I walked into a room. Her sudden interest in paperwork she never used to touch. The way she lingered at the mailbox, scanning envelopes before slipping them inside. It became unbearable, living with the mask. I needed to act, but I couldn't storm into Brianna's life with wild accusations and no evidence. Dan was a lawyer. He would spin words into weapons. Margaret was cunning. She would twist emotions into leverage. If I came at them without proof, I'd be the one painted as irrational, paranoid, unstable. That's when I remembered the phone in my pocket. I had already overheard their conversation once. But to protect myself, I needed more than memory. I needed their own voices admitting the truth. So, the next time I suspected a private conversation upstairs, I left my phone recording in Brianna's old bedroom. And it worked. What I captured was damning. Margaret mocking 25 years of marriage. Dan calmly calculating legal strategies. Their cold discussion about how to seize assets and manipulate timelines. The way they referenced Brianna, her psychology license, her professional credibility, as if it were just another tool in their arsenal. It was worse than I remembered. When I played it back later in my office, Margaret's laughter didn't sound like the woman I had loved. It sounded like a stranger, a predator, mocking the life we had built together. And so I sat there, night after night, listening, rewinding, listening again. The words cut me fresh each time, but I needed them etched into my bones, because I knew eventually I'd have to reveal them. But reveal them to whom? That question haunted me. Part of me wanted to march straight to the courthouse, slam the recording on a judge's desk, and watch Margaret and Dan burn in their own lies. But another part of me, the father in me, hesitated. Because Brianna stood at the center of it all. How do you tell your daughter that her mother and her husband have betrayed everything sacred? How do you force her to choose between loyalty and truth? I wrestled with it for days. Every night, I sat alone in my office, staring at that phone, replaying the words, trying to summon the courage. On the sixth day, Brianna visited my office. She said Margaret had asked her to conduct a professional evaluation of me. That alone was enough to confirm the depth of their scheme. Margaret wanted to paint me as unstable, abusive, unfit. And she had tried to weaponize Brianna's psychology license to do it. It was the cruelest move yet. When Brianna told me what her mother had asked, something in me finally snapped into clarity. I could not protect her from the truth any longer. She deserved to know. So I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out the phone, and said quietly, "There's something you need to hear." I watched her carefully as the recording played. At first, her face remained still, her expression professional. She was a psychologist, trained to observe, to compartmentalize, to hold emotion at bay. She listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Margaret's voice filled the office, sharp and mocking. 25 years of playing the devoted wife. Dan's calm calculation. By the time he realizes, everything will be tied up legally. Minute by minute, Brianna absorbed the evidence. Her composure held, for a while. But when her mother's words twisted into cruelty, mocking marriage, mocking me, I saw Brianna's jaw tighten. Her fingers clenched into fists, then slowly released. By the time the recording ended, silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, Brianna spoke. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "How long have you known?" "6 days," I admitted. "I overheard them at your house last Tuesday." She leaned back, eyes narrowing. "And you've been what?" "Building a defense strategy while pretending everything was normal." "Something like that." She exhaled slowly, processing. Then she said the words that broke my heart and mended it at the same time. "Mom asked me to evaluate your mental state. She wanted me to provide a professional opinion that you were exhibiting abusive patterns." I felt the ground tilt beneath me. "What did you tell her?" "That I couldn't ethically assess someone without proper evaluation, and that her claims seemed inconsistent with your established behavioral patterns." Her voice hardened. "She tried to use my training as a weapon, Dad. Against you. Against professional standards. Against me." I wanted to apologize for dragging her into this nightmare. But before I could, she shook her head. "Don't apologize. I'm glad I know the truth. The question is, what happens now?" I studied her face in that moment. The determination in her eyes, the steel in her voice. I saw the strength I had tried to give her as a child, but also the independence I could never control. "That's your choice, Brianna," I said quietly. "I won't ask you to choose sides." She rose from her chair. "Decision already made. I already have. I choose truth over family loyalty. I choose evidence over emotion. And I choose to support the parent who didn't try to manipulate my professional ethics." Relief surged through me, tempered by worry. "What about Dan?" Her face hardened. "What about him?" "My husband participated in a conspiracy to destroy my father. That marriage is over." I opened my mouth, but she cut me off with a calm clarity that chilled me. "Dad, I'm not making this decision in anger. I'm making it based on character assessment and behavioral evidence. I'll testify honestly about family dynamics if needed, but I won't be anyone's weapon. Not Mom's. Not Dan's. Not yours." I nodded slowly. "I understand." "Good," she said. Then her expression softened just slightly. "Because there's one more thing I need to do." She left my office with the stride of someone who had found moral clarity. 20 minutes later, she would walk into her own home to confront the man who had betrayed not just her father, but the very ethics she had built her life on. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Brianna's key turned in the lock at exactly 7:30 p.m. The house she shared with Dan smelled faintly of whiskey and stale takeout. Legal documents lay scattered across the coffee table like discarded weapons, and there he was, my son-in-law, sprawled across the couch with his tie loosened, glass in hand, the mask of composure already slipping. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk," she announced, her tone sharp enough to cut through the haze of alcohol in the room. She set her purse on the entryway table with deliberate precision, every movement a signal of control. Dan glanced up lazily, trying to slip back into the role of casual husband. "Rough day?" The Barrett deposition got postponed again. Brianna's voice was flat. "I know about the conspiracy, Dan." The words dropped like a hammer. His head snapped up, eyes narrowing. For a moment, he didn't breathe. Then, with a lawyer's reflex, he reached for denial. "What conspiracy?" "The one where you and my mother planned to financially destroy my father while using my psychology credentials to support false abuse allegations." Her stance remained unflinching. "I heard the recording. Every word." Dan set his whiskey glass down with exaggerated calm, but his hands trembled. "Brianna, you're misunderstanding. You've taken things out of context. 25 years of playing the devoted wife." Her voice sliced through his lie. "Sound familiar?" The blood drained from his face. Dan Thompson, who could charm juries and spar with Supreme Court justices, suddenly looked like a cornered animal. "How much did you hear?" he whispered. "Everything. Asset division. Timeline. Fee calculation. Mom's performance reviews." She stepped closer, her eyes locked on him. "Was our entire marriage part of this plan?" Dan swallowed hard, searching for words, but silence betrayed him. For the first time, Brianna saw her husband without his practiced mask, and what she saw wasn't strength. It was desperation. 3 days later, the fallout reached Margaret. At the Riverside Country Club, where she had spent years basking in the glow of social circles, whispers chased her like shadows. Women she'd lunched with for decades suddenly found their plates fascinating. Greetings were replaced with silence. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations dissolved. Margaret approached her usual table with a forced smile, only to find Janet Crawford already seated. Janet's tone carried false sweetness. "Margaret, dear, we missed you at the planning committee meeting yesterday." Margaret blinked. "What meeting? I wasn't informed." "Oh, didn't you get the message? We had to make some organizational changes. You understand." By the time Margaret sat down, she understood perfectly. The social doors were closing, one by one, with whispered efficiency. Her carefully constructed reputation was unraveling, and she couldn't stop it. Meanwhile, I was conducting my own campaign. I had no intention of screaming in court or making wild accusations. Instead, I leaned on 35 years of honest dealing. Credibility, once earned, becomes its own armor. Lunch with Tom Bradley at the bank was strategic. Over coffee, I shared just enough detail. Margaret and Dan developed concerning plans regarding assets to establish fact without bitterness. Tom's response was exactly what I'd hoped for. Professional concern, tempered with sympathy. That evening at the Chamber of Commerce meeting, Jim Morrison asked casually about Margaret's absence from a recent fundraiser. I let a note of sadness color my voice. Sometimes you discover people aren't who you thought they were. 2 years of marriage, and it turns out she was planning. I'm grateful I found out when I did. By Sunday night, Margaret's social exile was complete. The country club committee quietly reviewed her membership. Charity boards accepted her resignation, resignations she hadn't submitted. And Dan's collapse was accelerating in parallel. 3 major clients cut ties, citing concerns about judgment and ethical standards. The Miller Industries account, worth over $200,000 annually, sent a letter formally terminating representation. Dan was bleeding credibility in the one arena where he had once been untouchable, his profession. Sunday evening, I overheard Margaret's frantic call from her new apartment with Dan. Her voice carried through the thin walls like the wail of someone watching her empire crumble. "Everyone knows, Dan. Everyone. I can't show my face anywhere in this town." His response was sharp, brittle. We'll file emergency motions Monday morning. Force Alan into defensive position. Before what? She snapped. Before you lose your law license? Before I move back to my sister's house in Minnesota? Their bickering went on past midnight. Two conspirators realizing that shared guilt wasn't the same as shared solutions. Monday morning, Margaret marched into the office of Linda Hawthorne, a divorce attorney known for scorched earth tactics. The glass-walled conference room overlooked the courthouse, the very place where she hoped to destroy me. Linda reviewed the file with cool detachment. Mrs. Cole, your husband's financial protective measures appear legally sound. Joint account holders have rights to restrict access during marital discord. Margaret leaned forward, desperation bleeding through her practiced victimhood. It's financial abuse. He's controlling every aspect of my access to money we earn together. Linda tapped the papers. Money he earned, according to tax records. You haven't been employed since 1989. Margaret's face reddened. I built our home. I raised our daughter. That may be true, but legally, homemaking doesn't generate independent income. Margaret floundered. What about emotional abuse? Intimidation tactics? Linda's pen hovered. What specific incidents can you document? Margaret hesitated. He's controlling about money. Always has been. Linda's questions cut like knives. Threats? Physical intimidation? Isolation from family? Each answer was the same. No. For the first time, Margaret's carefully rehearsed victim story fell apart under scrutiny. 10 blocks away, Dan was unraveling too. That Monday, he answered a call from the Bar Association's Ethics Committee. Mr. Thompson, we've received additional complaints about your handling of client trust accounts, specifically, allegations of using client funds for personal expenses. Dan straightened in his chair, the lawyer's arrogance faltering. Those allegations are unfounded. My accounting is impeccable. Then explain why Martinez Electrical's invoices, submitted 8 months ago, remain unpaid, despite their case settling 6 months ago. The truth was damning. Dan had diverted settlement funds into his personal account, covering office rent and student loans. What he called cash flow management now looked like embezzlement. The committee's voice was cold. We're scheduling a formal hearing for Thursday morning. You'll need complete financial records for all accounts going back 18 months. Dan's hands shook as he hung up. The walls were closing in. By Wednesday, desperation had driven Margaret and Dan into dangerous territory. Their emergency strategy session in his nearly empty office felt like generals planning a final assault with no ammunition. We have to file domestic violence claims, Margaret insisted. It's the only way to force Alan into defensive position. Dan rubbed his temples. Margaret, false allegations are a felony. If this fails, we're both facing criminal charges. If we don't try, she snapped. I'm facing poverty, and you're facing disbarment anyway. At least this way we go down fighting. Her voice was icy, calculating. The voice of someone who had lost everything but the desire to destroy. Thursday morning would decide whether their gamble succeeded or ended everything. And I was ready. The Davenport County Courthouse carried a different weight that morning. For most people, family court was just another step in a painful divorce. A place where accusations flew and judges sifted through emotional rubble. But for me, that Thursday was more than paperwork or custody disputes. It was war. 35 years of reputation, honesty, and hard work had crystallized into the armor I carried into that courtroom. And sitting across from me were two people who had once claimed to love me, my wife and my son-in-law, now united in betrayal. Margaret entered first. She wore a conservative dress, minimal makeup, and a nervous demeanor. To the untrained eye, she looked like the picture of a battered wife. She had rehearsed this performance well, the trembling hands, the lowered gaze, the quiet sigh as she clutched her purse. Her attorney, Linda Hawthorne, walked beside her with an air of icy confidence. Linda had built her career on scorched-earth tactics, painting men as villains and wives as survivors. She was respected, feared, and, above all, relentless. Dan sat in the second row, shoulders tight, tie knotted perfectly. His presence was calculated, a supportive son-in-law, concerned for his mother-in-law's well-being. But the shadows under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. I sat at the defendant's table with James Morrison, my attorney. Unlike Linda, James wasn't flashy. He didn't need theatrics. 30 years of practicing law with integrity had earned him something more powerful than bluster: credibility. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided that morning. Stern, efficient, and utterly allergic to nonsense. She had seen every variety of family drama imaginable. Nothing shocked her. Nothing swayed her without evidence. The hearing began. "Mrs. Cole," the judge said evenly, "you allege that your husband engaged in financial abuse and intimidation. Please describe specific incidents that led you to fear for your safety." Margaret's voice trembled, just enough to seem authentic. "Your Honor, for months my husband has been restricting my access to our accounts. He monitors my spending, makes threats about what would happen if I tried to leave." The judge leaned forward. "What kind of threats?" "Financial threats. That I'd be left with nothing. That he'd use his business connections to destroy my reputation. And last week, he completely cut off my access to money, even for basic necessities." Her words painted me as a tyrant, cold and controlling. She spoke with such practiced vulnerability that, for a moment, I almost admired the performance. Almost. But then I remembered the recording. When Margaret finished, Judge Hendricks turned to James. "Does the defendant wish to respond?" James rose calmly, adjusting his glasses. "Your Honor, we have evidence that not only disproves Mrs. Cole's claims, but reveals a deliberate conspiracy to defraud my client of marital assets." The judge's brow furrowed. "That is a serious allegation, Counselor." James nodded. "Which is why we are prepared to present irrefutable evidence. Audio recordings, made 6 weeks ago, in which Mrs. Cole and her co-conspirator, Daniel Thompson, planned this exact scenario." The color drained from Margaret's face. Linda leaned in, whispering furiously to her client. But there was no salvaging what was coming. "Exhibit A," James said, connecting his phone to the courtroom speaker system. And then, Margaret's own voice filled the chamber. "When the old fool finally signs the papers, we'll have everything we planned for." The courtroom went silent, save for Margaret's recorded laughter. For 43 minutes, the recording played. Every word was a knife. Margaret mocking 25 years of marriage, Dan calculating strategies for asset seizure, the two of them discussing how to use Brianna's psychology credentials as a weapon. I sat still, eyes forward, as the room absorbed the truth. Dan shifted uneasily in his seat, sweat beading on his forehead. Margaret stared at the floor, her hands trembling for real this time, not from rehearsed victimhood, but from exposure. "The man actually believes I love him," her recorded voice declared, dripping with cruelty. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. When the audio ended, the silence was deafening. Judge Hendricks's gaze was ice. "Mrs. Cole, do you have any response to this evidence?" Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. Words failed her for the first time in years. Linda Hawthorne, the veteran litigator, went pale. She stood slowly. "Your Honor, I request permission to withdraw from this case. I was not informed of these circumstances when I agreed to representation." "Motion granted," Judge Hendricks replied curtly. Margaret turned toward her, panic flashing across her face. "Linda." But Linda had already gathered her papers, refusing even to meet her client's eyes. The judge's gaze fixed on Margaret with the weight of a gavel. "Mrs. Cole, your petition for a restraining order is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of possible perjury charges." The gavel struck, sharp as thunder. The performance was over. Margaret sat frozen, a woman who had built her entire case on lies, only to have those lies played back for the world to hear. Dan slumped in his seat, his career unraveling in real time. He, too, had been caught, not by my accusations, but by his own words. And I sat with a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. Triumph, because the truth had prevailed. Sorrow, because it had taken the destruction of a marriage, a family, to get there. 2 weeks later, the consequences became official. Margaret's deception obliterated any claim to spousal support. The prenuptial agreement she had signed back in 1979, something she had conveniently forgotten, limited her to minimal assets. She left the marriage with far less than she had schemed for. Dan's suspension from the bar turned into permanent disbarment after auditors uncovered $127,000 in missing client funds. He had called it cash flow management. The Bar Association called it theft. Margaret moved into a small apartment, her social circle reduced to whispers and pity. Dan packed up and disappeared to Nebraska, working as a paralegal, an echo of the career he once flaunted with arrogance. Brianna filed for divorce the day after the hearing. She cited irreconcilable differences, but the truth ran deeper. She was done with manipulation, done with betrayal. In her new practice, she began specializing in family therapy, helping others recognize the very patterns that had nearly destroyed her. The courtroom battle had ended with a gavel strike, but the echoes lingered. For Margaret, it was the sound of doors slamming shut, social, legal, financial. For Dan, it was the sound of a career collapsing. For Brianna, it was the sound of liberation, even at the cost of heartbreak. And for me, it was the sound of something I thought I'd lost forever. Vindication. Truth, cold and unflinching, had cut through their lies. And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe in something I hadn't dared to hope for. That the truth might actually matter. The courthouse battle had ended, but life after war always feels strangely quiet. For months, every day had been a fight. Papers served, depositions scheduled, lies prepared, strategies countered. My mornings had started with adrenaline and ended with exhaustion. And then suddenly, silence. The gavel fell. The recording spoke for itself. Margaret's lies crumbled, Dan's career collapsed, and I walked out of the courthouse not just free, but vindicated. But vindication doesn't erase scars. The social exile was swift and merciless. The same women who once praised Margaret's taste in china patterns now whispered about what she tried to do. At the country club, her name became shorthand for betrayal. She could no longer sit at luncheons or plan charity galas. Even the committees that once courted her reputation politely excused her. She moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment near her sister's place. Gone were the designer handbags, the catered dinner parties, the glossy facade of a well-kept life. She drove an aging Honda instead of the Lexus she once flaunted, and she clipped grocery coupons at the same stores where she used to glide through aisles with platinum credit cards. But the real loss wasn't financial. It was social. For Margaret, reputation had been currency, and now she was bankrupt. Dan fared no better. The Bar Association moved quickly, their ethics committee unsympathetic to pleas of misunderstood accounting. His disbarment became permanent, his name blacklisted in professional circles. The clients he once represented avoided him like contagion. He left the state in shame, landing in Nebraska as a paralegal, a hollow echo of the career he once wielded with arrogance. The man who once walked into courtrooms with tailored suits and smug confidence now drafted motions for junior attorneys half his age, his paycheck a fraction of what it had been. And word followed him. Even in Nebraska, colleagues knew. Whispers trailed him like shadows. That's the lawyer who stole from clients. That's the one who conspired with his mother-in-law. For Dan, the punishment was fitting. He had built a career on manipulation, and manipulation had destroyed him. My daughter bore the heaviest burden of all, discovering that both her mother and her husband had been conspirators. But Brianna is her father's daughter. Strong, steady, unwilling to let betrayal define her. The day after the courtroom hearing, she filed for divorce. No theatrics, no hesitation, just quiet resolve. She packed her things, left Dan's apartment, and returned to the modest rental she had lived in before marriage. Her work as a psychologist took on new meaning. Where once she had focused on academic theory, she now turned her energy toward family therapy, helping others recognize the warning signs of manipulation and control. Her clients saw not just a therapist, but a survivor, someone who understood what it meant to face betrayal and rebuild. I watched her reclaim her life with pride. She carried the scars, yes, but also the strength. In a way, Brianna's healing was my greatest victory. And me? I didn't come out untouched. 35 years of marriage leaves grooves in a man's life, and tearing them out doesn't just hurt. It changes you. The house felt emptier, quieter. The routines of marriage, the morning coffee brewed for two, the small conversations about bills or weekend plans, vanished overnight. At first, the silence felt heavy, but slowly, it became peaceful. I returned to the work I loved, my construction business still steady, my clients still loyal. If anything, my reputation grew stronger after the trial. People respected not just my craftsmanship, but my resilience. They knew I hadn't folded. Evenings were different. I took walks instead of arguments. I read instead of fighting over television channels. I reconnected with old friends, the kind Margaret had dismissed as too ordinary. Freedom, I realized, doesn't always come with celebration. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the small moments of living without fear of betrayal. What did I learn from it all? That betrayal rarely happens in a single moment. It grows in silence, in the spaces between conversations, in the glances that last a second too long. Margaret and Dan didn't ruin my life overnight. They chipped at it, brick by brick, until one day I realized the foundation had cracked. But I also learned that truth, though it moves slowly, has weight. Lies can dazzle for a season, but truth endures. I learned that reputation isn't built in courtrooms or at charity luncheons. It's built in decades of honesty, of showing up, of doing what you say you'll do. That was my shield when everything else collapsed. And I learned that family doesn't always mean loyalty. Sometimes, family wounds deeper than strangers ever could. But it also means that healing, like Brianna's, can be stronger than betrayal. Years later, when people ask me about Margaret, I don't speak with anger. Anger burns hot, but short. What remains is clarity. She tried to break me. She failed. Dan tried to outmaneuver me. He destroyed himself instead. And Brianna, she proved that even in the ashes of betrayal, something new can grow. So when I tell this story, I don't tell it as a man who lost. I tell it as a man who saw the worst of people, endured it, and walked out of the fire with his head high. Because in the end, betrayal may break trust, but it doesn't have to break you. Thanks for listening my story. Please share your thoughts in comment section and do subscribe to the channel.